Surrounded Russian soldiers have surrendered in Donetsk, but Ukraine's fortress Pokrovsk is in peril. Both sides have unleashed massive waves of long-range strikes, and US President Donald Trump has finally sanctioned Russian oil giants. As he said, conversations with Vladimir Putin too often come to nothing. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. There has been a lot of news for us to get through today in our clear and considered manner. I'm going to break it down into three sections. We're going to look at the close fight, we're going to look at those long-range strikes, and then we're going to look at the politics. In the close fight, east of Dobropilya, in a village called Kocheryev Yar, Russian soldiers have been filmed surrendering. Small groups of 4 or 6 soldiers waving white flags visible from Ukrainian drones. These are part of the Russian assault that punched north, threatening to cut off the town of Konstantinivka, threatening that highway linking Konstantinivka to Dobropilya and to Ukraine's supplies in the rear. Quite a significant Russian assault that caught Ukraine off guard. Small numbers of soldiers, you'll remember, infiltrating through the sparsely manned Ukrainian lines. Now, while Ukrainian sources are claiming that hundreds of Russian soldiers have been surrounded, it's impossible for me to verify those figures. What we have seen is small groups surrendering, and Deep State, the open source map which tracks the front line, certainly shows pockets of what was or Russian held territory now surrounded by Ukrainian forces. This is welcome good news for Ukraine, but further south in Pokrovsk, in Fortress Pokrovsk, the town that has become Russia's main effort for over a year, Russian soldiers have been infiltrating into the built-up area. There is confirmed geolocated footage of Russian forces around the train station. They've come in from the southwest of the town. And I was reading a fairly bleak analysis in the Kyiv Independent, suggesting that this infiltration, once they start to get into the built-up area, becomes harder and harder, nigh on impossible to clear those buildings. Ukraine's defenders in that town perhaps never expected to be there, to endure so long. And in many ways that has made Pokrovsk reminiscent of Bakhmut and Avdiivka after that. Their job, though, has been made extraordinarily difficult by the evolution of the drone war, and particularly the advent of the fiber optic drone, which is immune to electronic warfare jamming, and the saturation levels that Russia has been able to bring to the conflict. And what that's meant is it's incredibly difficult and incredibly dangerous to get supplies of soldiers, ammunition, food, all the things troops need to fight into the town, because these fiber optic drones, one of the tactics we've seen used is that they fly in, they land next to key roads, and they wait there in ambush, saving their battery but still connected to, tethered to their controller by that fiber optic wire, ready to ambush soldiers, vehicles, anything that tries to move into the area to resupply forces. We've seen responses to that, the evolution of drones doing the resupplies, but the inevitable results, you get fewer soldiers with fewer weapons holding an area under increased bombardment themselves. And we saw that choking of supply lines playing really key roles in this conflict right since the start. We saw when Russian soldiers were unable to resupply their own side on the right bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson, they made the decision to abandon the city. We saw what happened to Ukraine's soldiers who managed to occupy Russian Kursk. When their supply line was choked, their positions ultimately became untenable. So worth watching what happens in Pokrovsk. The analysis in that Kyiv Independent suggesting that there will be a tough decision to be made by Ukraine's commanders about how and when to make a seemly withdrawal. The suggestion being that previous withdrawals have perhaps been chaotic because Ukraine's troops were forced or ordered to stay on too long. These fights have been important to Ukraine because they've been inflicting losses, huge losses on Russian forces, because the only way that Russian forces have been able to inch forward is by sacrificing extraordinary numbers of people. But there comes a point perhaps where that ratio changes and it no longer becomes militarily wise or acceptable. In the deep strike campaign, we're going to talk about Ukraine attacking the Bryansk chemical plant significant because they used British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. These are air-launched, bunker-busting stealth cruise missiles, first supplied to Ukraine in 2023 and first authorized for strikes on sovereign Russian soil last year. When that happened, when Ukraine fired Storm Shadow missiles into Kursk last year, Russia responded with its Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile. That is a weapon which blasted to the edge of space, a nuclear-capable weapon which then hurtled down on the city of Dnipro in central eastern Ukraine at speeds of 13,000 miles per hour. Because it's a nuclear-capable weapon and because it's the sort of weapon that would be used in a nuclear war to attack targets in Europe, that was seen as a very provocative act of nuclear saber rattling. The United Kingdom called it depraved, Ukraine called it insane. We haven't seen a response like that yet. We'll come to Russia's response in a minute. Whilst we're on Ukraine's activities, they've been doing three things. They've been hitting industry, electricity and oil infrastructure. That attack on the Bryansk chemical plant, it made gunpowder, explosives and components for missiles. Ukraine described it as a key part of Russia's military-industrial complex. In terms of strikes on electricity, over a period of 5 days, there were 4 strikes on electricity substations east and southeast of Moscow between the 14th and 18th of October. An analyst suggesting that that is part of a campaign to cut off electricity to and around Russia's capital city. And not only would that bring the war home to ordinary people in the capital, the absence or lack of electricity may increase demand on diesel for things like transport. And of course, diesel is already in scarce supply. Why? Because of this ongoing campaign against Russia's energy and oil infrastructure. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. Ukraine has continued to hammer oil refineries, gas production facilities across Ukraine. Most recently, the Orenburg gas processing, that is some 1,200 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian territory. It's been hit for the second time within the last week, and the Ryazan plant has suffered its third attack since August. That's slightly closer, but still 600 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. And we've talked about the shortages this is causing in Russia. It also appears to be causing shortages in neighboring countries that rely on Russia for supply. So some of the stans also experiencing petrol shortages, and that's indicative of the rationing that Russia has been forced to impose and the export bans. Has it been one-sided? Well, absolutely not. Russia has, over the course of the last week, since the 16th of October, fired almost 1,400 missiles and drones. According to Ukraine's armed forces, that is 1,386 missiles and drones hitting Ukraine in the space of the last week, and 433 of them arriving in a single night, into the Tuesday night into Wednesday, the 22nd of October. And that strike, we know, killed at least 6 people. It injured scores more. It hit a nursery in Kharkiv, and it plunged large parts of this country into darkness, leaving cities, including Kyiv, without electricity and, for a time, running water. Some analysts suggesting that 60% of Ukraine's gas production has now been affected by these strikes. As we were driving across the country, we saw a huge plume of thick black smoke billowing hundreds of feet into the sky, which was, we understand, the result of a Shahed strike on some of Ukraine's infrastructure. The strike, though, that got perhaps the most attention was that one in Kharkiv, where a children's nursery was hit, some reports suggesting by up to 3 drones, and the building was set ablaze. 38 children, toddlers and their teachers were, thank God, cowering in the basement, and none of them were hurt. They had abided the air raid siren and done as they're supposed to do, but so many people don't, because these air raid sirens are all the time, almost all the time. Some suggestions that those drones may have been aimed at a recruiting centre. Perhaps you might argue a legitimate military target, but the point is that these Russian strikes aren't always hitting their intended targets, and they are far too often hitting places like hospitals, like schools, like homes, and that is why it's increasingly so important to find a way to end the war. And that brings me to the politics, the efforts outside Ukraine to try and stop this bloody conflict. Donald Trump has at long last sanctioned Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Rosneft on its own accounts for half of Russia's oil production, about 6% of global supply. And Donald Trump called these sanctions tremendous. We wait to see whether or not they will have an effect. He suggested that these companies are underpinning Russia's war machine. China and India have, as a result of this war in Ukraine, emerged as the largest buyers of Russian hydrocarbons. They are propping up the Russian economy. Although it was interesting, Donald Trump suggested that India's Narendra Modi had assured him he would stop buying Russian oil. We haven't really seen that yet. We wait to see the effect of these sanctions. A lot of you pointing out in the comments, that Donald Trump, calling him taco, Trump always chickens out, the idea that he flip-flops. It is dizzying, bewildering. He does appear to change his position very quickly. It's like waves coming in and waves going out. And so I think perhaps what we need to try and do is look at the direction of the tide. Are these waves part of a rising or a falling tide? And I would say that since Donald Trump took office for the second time, he started very much aligned with the Kremlin ideals. And whilst very recently we've seen him echoing President Vladimir Putin's talking points over the course of this year, it does seem that Donald Trump is gradually coming around to understand Ukraine and Europe's position on this conflict. In other news, politics, Belgium has set out its concerns over plans to raise 140 billion euros as a loan for Ukraine from frozen Russian assets. Why does Belgium matter? Because most of that money is held in Belgium, that frozen Russian cash held in Euroclear, which is effectively a sort of complicated bank, a clearing house for security transactions. Some 176 billion euros of Russian money, we understand, held, almost most of it in the Euroclear accounts. Belgium is the country that needs to be convinced of the legality of the workaround that Europe thinks it's come up with to try and use these assets to help Ukraine. But the Belgian point of view is that even during conflicts, even during World War II, this sort of seizure or use of enemy money held in different accounts was not undertaken. We've also heard, in good news for Ukraine, that Sweden is willing to sell Kyiv up to 150 of its Gripen E fighter jets. These are formidable fighter jets and particularly good for Ukraine because they're designed to be able to land and take off from unprepared runways. What are unprepared runways? They're motorways. They're long, straight roads. Ukraine is used to operating Soviet-era Sukhoi and MiG fighter jets. Those are also good at taking off from unprepared runways. It's slightly to do with air intakes and where the air comes in and how the air comes in and whether these air intakes suck up gravel and dirt from the road. F-16s, many NATO jets are actually less able or less suited to that sort of operations. And the reason those operations are important is because it allows pilots and planners and commanders to vary their routines, to not always rely on a small number or even a large number of airfields, because those airfields become prone and vulnerable to attacks. And the final thing today, before we get on to questions, is an extraordinary interview that we have heard from Vladimir Putin's chief child snatcher.
Свою мифологию о том, что мы насильственно вывозим детей, что мы меняем их идентичность, что мы их перевоспитываем. Пел песни на украинском языке все время. Его постепенно началось изменение сознания в сторону того, что есть на самом деле. То есть от этой пропаганды постепенно отходить.
Maria Lvov-Belova, who is a wanted war criminal but is also the Children's Commissioner, the Kremlin Children's Commissioner, gave an interview to try and dismiss and dispel the reasons why she's been indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which accuses her of forcibly displacing Ukrainian children. She said, they accuse me of stealing them, they accuse me of brainwashing, and that's not true. But then, in the same interview, this very friendly, far-side chat with a sanctioned Russian propagandist, she goes on to explain how she adopted a Ukrainian child called Philip from the bomb blitz ruins of Mariupol. You'll remember Mariupol, that city, that stronghold city that was besieged and almost totally destroyed in the first weeks of the war. She brought this boy to Moscow, where she says she adopted him, and she admits he did not want to be in Russia. And then she talks about how he was singing pro-Ukrainian songs. Everything to do with Moscow and Russia annoyed him. There were constant bouts of hysteria, she says. This was clearly a very unhappy child. And then she talks about how he gradually changed his mind, how she persuaded him to gradually change his mind. And she says now that when he goes back to Mariupol, he doesn't want to be there. He says, no, I want to go home. And if there was any, this is a confession. It really does. It's like watching a confession. She's trying to dismiss the allegations, but she's categorically admitting what she is accused of doing. It's extraordinary and it's worth a watch. As ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. Question number 1, could Tomahawk missiles destroy the Kerch Bridge? Many people in Ukraine, many of Ukraine's supporters want to see that bridge linking Crimea, occupied Crimea, to Russia, knocked out of action. Ukraine has tried repeatedly but failed. Tomahawk missiles, incredibly powerful. Even so, bridges remain really, really difficult targets for missiles. They would certainly have the best chance of any weapons in Ukraine's arsenal. An important caveat: almost everybody I've spoken to who's sort of in the know about this, about the Tomahawks, thinks that Tomahawks are a distraction. Donald Trump put them on the table, and then Trump appeared to take them off when he met Zelensky last week. Fundamentally, America has so few ground launchers that they would be unlikely to supply these missiles in significant enough numbers for them to make a big difference. What is interesting, perhaps, is that use of storm shadows into Bryansk this week may have had American sign-off. And the reason I say that is because one of the long delays about allowing Ukraine to use those weapons against targets in Russia is that the missiles, the Storm Shadow missiles and their French Scalp equivalents, rely on, to put it crudely, American mapping technology. And whilst they can operate without that, they operate less well, because the way they operate so well is they hug the terrain, they fly low to avoid radar before soaring up and then plummeting down onto their targets. Ukraine was very explicit that the Storm Shadows penetrated Russia's air defences, and that would suggest that they were operating at their best, and that would suggest that at the very least America gave its tacit approval to those strikes. Question number 2, should Russians in Europe be deported, evicted from Europe and sent home? I think the short answer is no. Overwhelmingly, Russians living in Europe are law-abiding, peace-loving citizens. There are clearly among their number spies and deep cover agents, but collective punishment like that I don't think is justified or warranted or called for. And finally, question number 3, has there been any more news on the civil unrest we saw in St. Petersburg, specifically the Swan Lake protest? Now, I didn't mention this last time, perhaps I should have done, but hundreds of young people gathered in St. Petersburg and sang the cooperative Swan Lake song, which has been banned in Russia. This is by an exiled musician called Noise MC, banned because it was seen as subversive. It makes repeated references to Swan Lake and its role, Swan Lake's role in Soviet-era propaganda. In the wake of that sort of very gentle but significant and rare protest in Russia, what did we see? Well, the singer, Daria Loganova, who was 18 years old, was hauled up before a court and jailed for 13 days. She is, we understand, still in custody, but is due to be freed next week. 13 days in prison, in a Russian prison, I'd say a pretty draconian sentence for singing a song in public, indicative of the culture that Russians live under. It was an important display of dissent, but I think it's a long way from toppling Vladimir Putin. Thank you as ever for your questions. If you have any, please ask them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can next time.